Ding 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 ding, it's ranking slop time. Yippee, yippee, wahoo! If you behave, maybe you'll get an iceberg video. I've now covered just about every Supermassive game on this channel and given my thoughts on every single storyline, so to cap off this massive project, here's a complete ranking of all 66 characters I've spoken about. This list features all of the major characters and even some minor ones from the first season of the DPA, as well as Supermassive's other 3 major narrative horror game releases, being Until Dawn, The Quarry, and the casting of Frank Stone. This video contains spoilers for literally all of these games. I've spoken about every character here at length, but since making those videos, some of which are over a year old, some of my takes have changed and I'll have new things to say about most of these characters. Some of them I like more, and some of them quite a lot less. Quick thanks to the channel members who chose this topic through the last member vote. This is going to be a long video, so get cozy, and let's get into the Supermassive character ranking, but first. This video is sponsored by Konami, who have asked me to talk to you about Silent Hill F, the latest game in my favourite horror series. As someone who spends a lot of time talking about how games need to uplift their writers and the importance of narrative in horror, it's amazing to see a series I hold so dear to my heart giving this much creative freedom to Ryokishi 07. Ryokishi is a writer I've been a fan of for years, since I first played Ume Neko over a decade ago in fact. His style is really unique and fun. It's this blend of introspective psychological horror and dark comedy. Konami handing the reins over to Ryokishi ensures this latest installment of Silent Hill will be filled to the brim with complex characterization and intriguing mysteries. Shifting away from the more industrial and Americanized designs of prior games, Ryokishi infuses the foggy town with a small-town folk horror twist and distinctly Japanese aesthetics. Speaking of his time writing for Silent Hill F, Ryokishi said, "I don't think I would mind if this was the last thing I ever wrote. This is a writer who really cares and believes in what he's doing." Silent Hill F is set to be an intimate slow burn with an emphasis on tension and atmosphere over jump scares. That said, these hauntingly uncanny monster designs should do plenty to spook you if that's what you're after. If you're interested in character-driven horror with raw psychological insights that blend truth and madness, then Silent Hill F is well worth your time to check out. You already know I'm going to be checking it out, so pick it up before the video essay comes out. Silent Hill F is available for pre-order on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S, and PC. This game launches on September 25th, 2025. Thanks again to Konami, and now on with the video. The Quarry's problem child, Silas, is one of the most infuriating characters I've ever come across, with a confusing timeline, derivative design, and wholly unsatisfying arc. Silas spends the majority of the game lurking off screen, only to throw himself in front of a car in the finale and then die with absolutely no fanfare or spectacle, or show up in the credits if the player makes a silly decision to kill an actually good character. Posing almost no threat, leaning into none of the interesting tropes of the werewolf genre, everything about this character feels unfinished, like a drunk intern wrote his entire story on a sticky note. Everything the player is supposed to infer about him relies on them making assumptions based on lazy stereotypes, and his arc ends inconclusively with his life being entirely in the hands of Laura, who would have no reason to take any pity on him, as Laura has already killed at least one child werewolf prior to this and seemingly has no remorse. It's a classic example of giving the player a choice to make it seem like the game is a lot more insightful and branching than it actually is. In reality, there's only one choice that feels narratively satisfying. Simply putting a button that says, "oh, you can do this too," doesn't make a fulfilling narrative choice. You need to actually write something that makes sense. Silas could be removed from the game and his role given to one of the senior Hacketts, and the entire game would be better off. There are other similarly redundant and bland characters in Supermassive's roster, but Silas is the worst because of the missed potential. There's no other major villain with so many missed chances, no other characters so entirely lacking in character. Silas is weaved into the fabric of the game. A major choice at the ending is what to do with him, but this choice actively contradicts everything we know about the character's present. Keeping him alive requires a full 180 of characterization that feels hollow. This character sucks, and the game would be better off without him.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Stan the Man is, despite how much I enjoy his narcissistic rambling, unfortunately a pretty pointless character, offering almost nothing to the narrative, literally always dying, and existing only in the worst parts of the casting of Frank Stone. There's basically no reason to be a Stan. This is an open letter to Supermassive though. Next time you want a pretentious letterbox critic in one of your games, shoot me an email.
What the hell? Oh my god!
One of the longest segments in my video on The Quarry was a lengthy rant about the missed potential of Ryan, how he starts strong but gets completely sidelined with the introduction of Laura and gradually loses all of his character traits. On repeat playthroughs since making that video, I've come to feel even more frustrated with this immense rift, and have also just generally found Ryan a lot less charming in the segments where he's good. Having seen Justice Smith in far more animated roles since that video came out, notably the Dungeons & Dragons movie, I'll admit this is far from his best performance, and the bland characterization combined with the complete lack of an arc from the midpoint of the game onward makes Ryan almost impossible to keep defending. Ryan has a lot of implicit characterization as is shown through his early segments with Chris Hackett and his fellow counsellors, but none of this manifests into anything interesting, leaving Ryan a tasteless husk in the shape of a protagonist. Ryan chapters 1 through 3 could probably show up higher on this list, but he becomes such a wet flannel of a character after Laura shows up. If he survives the finale, he sits in a car with a girl who killed some of his friends and potentially his father figure, and a man who is arguably to blame for the whole situation, and he just cracks jokes. He doesn't feel real. Why are we cracking jokes here? What are you, Deadpool? Like a stupidly deadpan, zero charm Deadpool? What's going on? There's a lot to be done with this character, but it's at best poorly implemented and at worst completely forgotten and ignored.
Fishy to be, but I don't know ye. Fishy on me, it's a fishy to be.
Julia is the source of one of the most frustrating deaths in Man of Medan, where the player can bring her all the way to the end of the game only to have her die of decompression sickness she contracted right at the start if they made a bad choice. It's all a big gotcha. In spite of this, her lack of interesting set pieces and having almost no interplay with other characters means I don't particularly care if she sticks around or not. Both her brother and determinant fiancé do almost nothing to inform her arc, leaving her a side character in a game where she's set up to do a lot more. This is arguably a product of the way Man of Medan works, where almost every scene from the halfway point onwards can be done by any combination of characters, meaning that none, save Comrade, have set story beats that relate specifically to them. However, this lack of specificity in character direction is most direly felt with Julia. You could replace her with a sock puppet in every single scene and the game wouldn't feel any different. Welcome to the boring filler character lightning round. Supermassive has a lot of characters who I like to call substitutes, being generally half-developed individuals who can show up to add some padding to the game if they need to. Brad, Erin, and Daniel fill this role for the Dark Pictures anthology, being characters with at most one interesting set piece, who your co-op partner can fill the role of if they lose the important character for a scene. In the larger games, Until Dawn and The Quarry, we also see substitute characters in Matt and Nick, though in this instance these characters serve more to tutorialise basic concepts before completely falling off the plot and disappearing for almost the entire game. Of the two, I prefer Matt, as he actually shows up again after his tutorial ends, but his role is largely the same and neither have too much bearing on the plot or real staying power. Augustine Lieber is another entry in the poorly implemented villain roster, being a character with, again, a lot of implicit lore, but very little actual substance or development. She spends most of the game slightly to the left of frame, cosplaying as an Elden Ring character, making occasional appearances to nudge the plot before retreating into the shadows. You know a character is terrible when I can point to Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull being a better implementation of a trope. Augustine is emblematic of all the issues with the casting of Frank Stone. She's a character designed to write wiki articles, not invest a player, and that's bad. Robert is basically another substitute character who makes the timelines of the casting of Frank Stone line up if everyone else dies. Given that the two timelines are separate universes, there's no reason for this to be the case. So he's arguably just another boring filler character, just one with seemingly elevated purpose. In spite of that, he's a fellow socially awkward horror nerd, so I had to bump him up a bit. Plus, Robert does get some interesting set pieces, and he defeats Frank Stone if everyone else fails, so I guess power scaling wise he's up there, at least above Frank Stone. Could Robert beat Goku? I don't know, you decide. Maybe the entity should have picked him up, he seemed kinda good compared to some of the other candidates. I've got nothing else to say about Robert, moving on. Oh dear, another casting of Frank Stone character this low down. I really hope they start to do better. Much like Robert, Bonnie is a character who shows up and hangs about in the background, advancing the plot where relevant. Her main role is to die in horrific ways whenever the game needs to speed up the pacing, be it in the introductory PT clone segment, or when the 1980s timeline needs to establish some stakes. She's pure slasher fodder, nothing more. Bonnie is probably the first example I can think of who fills two generic horror tropes and dies to further two people's arcs within a single story. Like, she's the generic dead mum in horror for Maddie, and the tragic friend who wants to escape the small town in Linda's story. It's kind of amazing how they split her into two generic horror tropes, both of which are entirely reliant on her dying, tragically and suddenly, for the sake of someone else's arc.
I just lost my dog.
Tom is a funny character that made me chuckle a few times. I like the way he talks about his dog. He shows up, serves his role, and then vanishes. He's more of a vehicle for Sam Green's character, and that makes it hard to feel any strong emotions for him. That said, he's fun for what little time he has, and I like funny little gimmick characters, because the studio doesn't have too much opportunity to mess them up. Well done, Tom, you're better than a few actual characters.
I'm dead!
Hannah from Until Dawn, Marie and Jeff from The Devil and Me, and Joe and Charlie from Anna Medan are prologue characters that set up the mystery and then die. They have fun set pieces and do wonders for establishing tone, but they don't have too much in the way of actual character. In the Until Dawn remake, they took out some of Hannah's more janky dialogue, and that was one of the worst decisions they ever made in my opinion, because that terrible dialogue is incredibly stilted, but it adds to the campy B-movie vibe of Hannah's segment. Patch it back in, you cowards, make the game worse and it'll get better, trust me on this. Joe's prologue is unlike any other in the series. It's exceptionally jump scare heavy and really just sets up the grimy tone of Man and Medan, and I actually think the Marine World War II aesthetic is more interesting than anything else in the game, and I would have liked the entire game to be set in this prologue. The same goes for Marie. I really like the old-timey Chicago setting and the inclusion of H.H. Holmes. It felt more coherent than the rest of the game. That said, whilst these characters do their jobs well, they don't have enough to really stand out, and I don't think they'd have the staying power to be long-term protagonists.
This is so silly.
Maddie's opening set piece does a lot to establish her character, and then she kind of falls by the wayside. She's unfortunately treated like she'll have a lot more relevancy than she actually has, being routinely overshadowed by other main characters like Sam and Linda. Perhaps then she's a fitting mascot for the casting of Frank Stone, having a few good segments but ultimately being overshadowed by more interesting contemporaries.
Burn the witch!
Eliza is the worst of the narrator type characters. She's based on a bland stereotype with little delineation from the most obvious story they could have given her. Most of her dialogue is just reading item descriptions word for word, so if you take the time to read your collectibles, you're wasting your time because she'll give you the audiobook version later. The cutscene tied to the Hierophant Tarot is the only interesting bit of wider characterization for Eliza, but it doesn't actually show you anything you wouldn't have picked up on just from playing the game. I also find her general demeanor irritating. Like, she's so negative and rude the entire time, even though she expects you to help her out and shouldn't have anything against you specifically. All around bad character, not the worst, but pretty bad.
I'm obnoxious.
Christine is a good character in terms of effectively driving the plot forward, at least for the first half of the story, but around halfway through the timeline splits and she loses a lot of her relevancy. She serves her narrative purpose and I don't have any major gripes with her character, I just find her to be a bit overbearing and irritating for the first half of the game and far too passive in the second half, to the point where she feels like two separate characters. Also, the most interesting fan theory about this game was tied to her and the devs shut it down and said it wasn't true, something I've never seen them do with any of their other games. Frank Stone is a very insecure character. He routinely changes designs, has conflicting motives, and different methods of killing which shift every appearance. Perhaps this is intentional, the game takes place on a multiversal scale, but it only waters down his truly definitive traits. I still love the original Frank Stone design, the mask alone is amazing, he looks like some kind of mechanical animal. I don't really like the ghost or flesh monster versions of Frank though, these feel like rejected Man of Medan hallucinations, they're trying way too hard. Frank has minimal presence outside the end of each segment and the prologue, but the game doesn't do all that much to build the threat or mystery of him because we get told basically everything right at the start. So he's just kind of hanging about off screen until the plot needs to let him kill people. It's not a great way to navigate the slasher formula in my opinion. Frank is just lacking a lot of presence and threat and really definitive moments to make him stand out. Jaime is the funny man of the casting of Frank Stone with a lot of charisma and honestly good jokes. However, much like many other Supermassive characters, he falls off completely after his first potential death, which is quite early in his case. Also, for all the charisma of the performance by Andrew Weald and Dennis, Jaime isn't really given a whole lot to define him as a character other than very stock tropes that don't get developed too much. He's forced into an awkward love triangle and also has this family drama with his sister and parents that feels like it's straight out of a Lifetime movie. What's crazy about all this is that Jaime is implied to be Frank's most important and crucial victim, the one that got away and prevented him from fully summoning the entity, so Jaime is set up to be important to Frank specifically, but he just dies with little to no fanfare or spectacle, and fundamentally nothing changes if he lives. The plot with Jaime is constantly at odds with itself, the story sets up plot lines and abandons them, all for a cheap shock factor death at the midpoint. Were it not for the energy of the performance he would be lower, but for making me laugh and having a few fun moments in the earlier chapters, Jaime is elevated out of the absolute bottom tier. Kate from The Devil in Me is a pretty confusing protagonist, and I'm not really sure as to why that is. I think it's because The Devil in Me is a game that lacks a lot of direction, so its protagonist just has this strange arc. Generally, when you're writing a story, your protagonist should interface with the themes and drive the plot forward. They should give player, reader, viewer, whatever, a unique lens into a world you've crafted. This lens is most interesting when it's challenged by the conflicting views of other characters, particularly your villain, or perhaps the contradictions and unreliability inherent to your main character. But The Devil in Me is a game that doesn't really have a lot by way of themes. Most of the characters don't really challenge each other all that much, and motives and focus seem to shift each chapter as the game constantly switches up the tone and characters fall by the wayside. So I can tell you a lot of things about Kate. I know her friend was killed when she was young and that traumatized her. I can tell you she's an ambitious journalist who strives for truth. I can tell you she's leaving her company in search of greener pastures, and that's causing a rift in her relationship with her on-again, off-again boyfriend and co-worker Mark. I can tell you she's confident and happy in front of a camera, but her adversarial nature sometimes causes arguments with people she holds close, and she's a bit of a lone wolf because of that. So I know a lot about Kate. I understand the way I'm supposed to see the world through her lens, but as far as any of these traits playing out, informing her arc or driving the story forward, I can't really tell you anything. Yes, her relationship with Mark is fraught, but it's largely been resolved by the time the game throws a major choice at the couple. The same is true of most of her antagonistic relationships with characters like Jamie and Charlie. Yes, stuff from her past is brought up and Dumet uses it to attack her, but this is only once to slightly unnerve her rather than being a focus of the story or something he plays upon to drive home the psychological damage he's aiming for. So Kate has a lot of traits, but when you write a character in a vacuum and not around your greater narrative, honestly the best thing you can hope for is hype moments and aura, which is kind of hard to do within the horror genre unless you're Ash from The Evil Dead. Characters aren't just defined by their traits, they're defined by the integration of these traits within the story, and this is proven by Kate. She's a lot of character details, but none of them really come up.
Do it again, exactly like you did the last time.
You can kind of just go back to everything I just said about Kate and apply it to Mark, but he has more fun gameplay segments, so I like him a bit more. There isn't a lot to say about Mark really. Again, I can tell you a bunch of stuff about him, but none of it really plays out into anything of real substance. Dumet can keep Mark alive to use him as new bait, but if Mark dies or escapes, Dumet still baits more people in, so he doesn't really need him. Also, Mark being forced to make a really difficult decision regarding Kate would have been a lot harder if he'd shared more scenes with her, but they spend most of the game separated and it rings a bit hollow. I don't know, I'm just not really that big of a fan of Mark. I think they could have done a lot more with him, but he's kind of wishy-washy. He spends a lot of the game alone, so having the most important choice regarding another person being tied to him is strange because we don't really get to see him develop this bond.
The animatronic characters here do get a bit quirky at night.
Dumet is a really confusing villain. I've spoken about him at length before, but seriously, what's this guy's deal? Like, what's his problem? Why did he do any of that? What an odd bloke. He's a H.H. Holmes imitator, but not really. He's charismatic enough to get a family to give him their mansion in a Mr. Ripley-esque scheme, but also silent the entire game with negative presence. He's an invincible robot, but also gets knocked out by a random out-of-shape old man. He's a tactical genius with a CIA background, but his plans are routinely half-baked and easy to escape from. He's got this whole Norman Bates mother thing going on, but the game doesn't really do any psychological horror with it, and he kills hundreds of people for a system of using a survivor from a group of victims to lure in new victims, but he can literally explode and die and keep going without doing any of it, so what's the point? Dumet has this psychosexual fascination with the final moments of someone's life, of capturing their essence in recordings and building animatronics, but he doesn't really push the characters to the edges of emotion as harshly as he potentially could. He could definitely do a lot more to stir the pot. This game isn't really sure if it wants to be psychological or just kind of a Saw-type splatterfest, and this unwillingness to commit fractures Dumet. I really feel like Dumet should have been two people. I know some people say that's the case, I know there's theories, but I'm talking about actually confirmed plot points with interesting usage within the plot. Dumet feels like one of those writing games where you write a chapter of a book or something and then hand it over to a friend and let them continue it. He switches up like every chapter. He's like Boat Murdered, but if it was a slasher villain and not quirky or fun.
Why are you the way that you are?
Taylor is so annoying. Every single scene, she's just complaining and antagonizing other characters. She doesn't get much better as the game goes on. She has no arc. But I wrote a full 30-minute long rewrite of Little Hope with her at the center because her connection to Tanya and the witchy background of the town is really conceptually interesting. There's a lot we can infer about the way the town twists the past to create the present set of characters just through her. When I think back on Little Hope, when I try and analyze its themes and what it's trying to say, I always find myself drawn to Taylor and Tanya. But then I boot up the game again and I absolutely hate every second I spend with her. It's such a strange contradiction.
I'm going to kill you?
Dar is an incredibly minor character, but I feel he's really important in terms of really driving home the themes of House of Ashes. House of Ashes is all about conflict, healing, and the importance of finding bonds in family and friendship to rid yourself of the almost parasitic effects of hatred. Hate, as it is depicted in House of Ashes, is an irrational, alien thing, something that infects someone and slowly robs them of their humanity. The metaphor of the vampire aliens isn't subtle at all. so it makes sense that Dar, a minor villain, will always meet his end through clinging to his prejudices at a point in the game where every other character is striving to collaborate. Dar is a personification of hatred, nothing too abstract from the game's themes, but he really drives home the point that the villains in the game aren't just alien vampire bat things, they're representative of very real, very human emotions. Human emotions that are given a face and voice by Dar. He's a very minor character, but feels like a necessary inclusion. Nick from House of Ashes is the weakest playable character in the best game of the DPA, which is to say he's just fine. House of Ashes is so rich in characterization that a character that would otherwise be all the way down in the filler character tier with the likes of Brad, Erin and Daniel still feels realized as a character. What's funny is that Nick is way more of a substitute than any of those characters. He's basically just Jason's right hand man and the other man in Rachel's affair, so he's 2 for 2 on being a side character. But where this is just a quirk of the writing of the DPA in most other cases, Nick is actually informed as a character by his role as a substitute, and that plays into his issues with inferiority and culminates in his self-sacrificing move to attack the alien nest entirely alone. So whilst Nick fills this same role of being this side character substitute, Kuram Rahman, the writer of House of Ashes, and the rest of the team behind this game focused in on it and actually had it inform his arc. Nick has a few brilliant set pieces, and his soul assault on the Hive, his routine battles with the Ancient One, and his first interaction with Salim are all great. Whilst I find his arc with Rachel to be kind of hollow, she clearly doesn't like him anywhere near as much as he likes her, and her reuniting with Eric is much more thematically satisfying in my opinion. I did enjoy my time playing as Nick. The Ancient One is a silent killer in the vein of Frank Stone and Dumet, but I like the Ancient One better than both of the others because they feel a lot more relevant to what the game wants to say. Whilst yes, they are just another silent killer who shows up to harass you every few chapters, I think the added context of the Ancient One being whichever prologue character broke their truce first is compelling and adds to the thematic weight of the parasite being emblematic of hatred and prejudice. House of Ashes is not all that complex with its themes, but it does a brilliant job of making everything feel interconnected, and the Ancient One is just one aspect of this. That said, this character is often overshadowed in Fear Factor by the far more interesting looking giant bat aliens, which I feel are just better antagonists for a game with this kind of action twist. Supermassive leans a lot on just kind of rotting looking people as their villains, like just kind of spooky faces. So I would like to see more in the vein of the aliens. They are crazy, they're so good. They're so well designed, I'm a big fan of them. Bring them back.
I mean, it's alright, like...
2024 Linda is boring, but I really like 1980s Linda from the casting of Frank Stone. She holds a total monopoly on the camera segments that are genuinely fun and add much needed gameplay depth to the Supermassive's formula. She's consistent in characterization and generally doesn't overstay her welcome. In fact, quite often she's the person who says, okay, let's move on from this location to the next, and pushes the game forward. Linda is one of the only characters in casting of Frank Stone I was consistently excited to play as because she was given basically all of the interesting segments, being both the POV for the final chase for most of 2024, and almost all of the fun camera segments in 1980 are hers. Linda isn't breaking any new ground for Supermassive, and she's hardly oozing with characterization and uniqueness, but for what she is, she serves her purpose within the narrative just fine, and unlike almost everyone else in casting of Frank Stone, I didn't hate playing as her. Max and Laura are both kind of frustrating for different reasons. I like both of them in a vacuum. I'm on record saying that if the Quarry was entirely about them, then I'd probably enjoy it more, but they've still got problems. Max is hardly even in the game, but through appearances in exactly 2 chapters, he did more as a compelling tragic werewolf than Nick, Silas, and the entire Hackett family. I found his dialogue to be endearing and very natural with Laura, which is high praise as these games are often quite stilted with their deliveries. Laura is a character I like a lot in isolation, but much like Max, she actively overshadows the characters who we had gotten to know up until her arrival halfway through the game. The game pauses to give you her entire backstory, and from that point onwards the game is entirely about her. She completely overshadows Ryan as a focal point, she does everything Caitlin does better, and on top of all that she's got complete video game protagonist alley cat morals, which is actually a trope most of these games don't fall into. Laura shows up and is just gunning people down with glee and almost no remorse. Even when she's confronted with the fact that she's killed total innocents routinely, she doesn't care. She can wipe the entire Hackett bloodline off the face of the planet, but then randomly feel remorse for Silas at the end, even though he's quite literally the only person she should want to kill given her stated aim of curing Max. So whilst I find Laura and Max charming, I think they have great rapport, I think they're interesting characters, and I generally enjoyed playing as Laura. I actually really like their dedicated jail chapter in fact. I think Laura kind of ruins the Quarry by retroactively making everything prior to her inclusion feel pointless. She feels like a protagonist from a different story, and I would have just rather played that story.
Luffy is the man who become king of the pirates!
Olsen and Alex are a really good pairing when you talk about the design choices of Man and Medan and how they can perhaps be learned from to understand the Supermassive formula, so strap in for a really long segment here. Olsen and Alex are parallel characters. They have almost identical motivations of finding the Manchurian gold, irrespective of the legality of their acquisition of it. Both bring their inexperienced younger brothers along, both are riddled with hallucinations and have clear deterioration on board the ghost ship, and assuming Alex survives his less satisfying deaths, the game ends with a showdown between him and Olsen in the depths of the boat. The question here is obviously, when these characters are so similar, what makes one a protagonist and the other an antagonist? Well, this could be explored in great depth with Man and Medan. The central threat is a gas that exposes your deepest fears and insecurities, and through that we could get glimpses into the motives and psyches of Alex and Olsen under pressure and see what drives Alex to escape and try and protect his loved ones, whilst Olsen leaves his brother and crewmates to rot whilst he relentlessly pursues the gold. What is the fundamental difference that makes one good and the other bad? This is nothing too phenomenal in terms of writing. Almost every 5 out of 10 Marvel movie hits you with a "what if the good guy but evil" type villain, but it's certainly a lot better than what we got, wherein Olsen and Alex have minimal overlap and both kind of just wander about the ship until their arc concludes. I would have liked to see them have more interplay. However, I would argue this issue is symptomatic of what Man and Medan wanted to do, and some potential limitations of the genre. Man of Medan is, to this day, the single most branching game Supermassive have ever made. It's got an insane number of endings, optional chapters, character deaths can happen basically whenever. The game was made for all the people who talk about illusion of choice and want a narrative game to be as sandboxy as possible. But in allowing for so many variables, Man and Medan actually robs itself of some of its narrative catharsis. I don't remember any set moment from this game as much as I remember the final scene of Until Dawn, which is only possible because Sam quite literally cannot die prior to that. This is the same for Telltale's Walking Dead and Life is Strange. These games are a lot more linear and allow for much less choice, but as a result have much more climactic and cathartic endings. So where's the middle ground? Obviously these games shouldn't be movies. The interactivity and ability to make choices is what makes them games, and part of what makes them so charming and fun to discuss with others. But if you give the players completely unrestricted free reign, then there comes a point where they just rob themselves of any kind of interesting narrative. Is that a choice the writers should have let their players make? To decide a game is bad because they've played it wrong? This is a pretty big question and one I don't even have an answer for. I just wanted to put it out there and see what you think. I really like the arc between Alex and Olsen, but it requires you to make specific choices and meet the developers halfway to get the most out of it. It's something that's a lot more interesting when you sit down and think about it than it is in the immediate moment. It doesn't have the same gravitas as stories like Josh's and Until Dawn, which basically always plays out the same. So whilst I don't dislike this dynamic, it's something the player has to opt into to get the most out of, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. Is it a good thing that a player can give themselves a terrible story because they played the game incorrectly? Is it up to the developers to try and make every choice feel as cathartic as possible? If they do that, then surely the game becomes quite stock, right? Like every single arc plays out kind of the same. I don't know, it's weird. It's weird to think about. Coming in at the halfway point, I have to decide on the definitive most mid-Supermassive character. A character who is equal parts reflective of the studio's capacity to write fully realised and multifaceted characters with interesting decisions that feel relevant to them, yet branching enough to incentivise repeat playthroughs, but also a character that falls into all the usual Supermassive trappings of being kind of inconsistent, falling off randomly halfway through the game, and missing a lot of their potentially interesting characterisation due to the game not really expanding on the concept at the heart of the character. I think I found the perfect midpoint here with Angela from Little Hope. Angela is the first person to be hunted by a demon in Little Hope, and she's pursued the most doggedly by hers, having some really interesting chases. On top of that, her arc can play out in a lot of different ways. She can go with either of the game's groups through the town, and that gives the player entirely new segments with her. She ties into the game's themes of witchcraft and the present correcting the past really well, with her past selves being older and more maternal women who are the first to be condemned by the power structure, and her present self being an icy standoffish woman who keeps others at arm's length. So I like Angela. That said, she suffers from every single common Supermassive issue. Running out of steam and having nothing to do for the second half of the game? Check. Stilted dialogue and forced conflict with characters that feels petty given the stakes and real issues at hand? Check. Being an interesting concept but having very little wider development? Check. Feeling inconsequential in the wider point the game is trying to make? Check. So Angela is just mid. I think she's pretty par for the course as to how Supermassive tends to write characters, so if you want a character that perfectly sums up what basically every character of these games is like in the abstract, then look no further.
If you see a bitch in the alley with a bad bob, that is not me.
I think I like Caitlyn a lot more now than I did when I last spoke about the Quarry, but I'm still not completely sold on her. I like Brenda's song, I like that Caitlyn is extremely competent and just kind of silently solves problems and fixes things for people. I like her rapport with Dylan, but she just doesn't have all that much screen time or interesting things to do. She's one of the major victims of the Quarry's characters treading all over each other's arcs. Caitlyn doesn't get given a whole lot to do for most of the game. She has exactly one real set piece, being the chase through the house, and that can end really quickly depending on the player's decisions. You can play the game and get like a combined 10 minutes of Caitlyn playtime in a 10-hour game. So whilst I like Caitlyn, I like the performance, I like her as a character, I don't have a whole lot to say beyond that. She's likeable, sure, but she's outdone by other characters in each of her respective traits. She's a good leader, but Ryan and Laura outdo her at this. She's a confident marksman and one of the more self-reliant counselors, but Laura also beats her here. She's also less interesting as a romantic option than Dylan when it comes to the game's central love triangle. And she's not quite thorough and introspective in the same way that Abby is. So, whilst I'd like Caitlyn, there are at least 4 characters in the cast that do everything she does but better, which makes her feel like a bit of an afterthought. Also, her dying because she gets stuck in a fridge is goofy.
Man, I'm dead.
The Stranger is just a horror trope done well, no real notes. He shows up, establishes the threat, and then dies. He also acts like a bit of a red herring, which adds to how confusing the first half of Until Dawn is on an initial playthrough. And his notes are a good source of lore for the wiki heads out there. Good for what he is, but he doesn't do anything that new.
Pirates on the boat.
Much like Alex, Fliss is a character who changes a lot based on how you play Man of Medan. If Conrad escapes right at the start, then she basically has nothing to do, as she's primarily written as his love interest. Without Conrad, she's basically a Brad tier filler addition. This is strange because Fliss knows the area well, she knows about local legend, she should be able to give a bit more context and exposition to the game, but this isn't really the case. Fliss's background, all the stuff about her fake boating license, her implicit knowledge of piracy in the local waters, it doesn't really ever become relevant and is honestly just a red herring to make you not fully trust her at the start. But she's a playable Supermassive character, so of course she isn't even remotely villainous. This studio doesn't ever let you play as bad guys. If Conrad sticks around, then Fliss is an interesting character with some cool integration in the Glamour Girl chapter, and a handful of fun segments where the budding romance is put to the test as the pair are put through the psychological ringer. I like this arc, but only around half the players are ever gonna see it. So Fliss is a good character if you play the game in a way that makes her a good character. The game doesn't know what to do with her if you make certain choices, and she becomes very, very bland very easily.
Battle of the Books?
The Curator is just fun. I think he's used better in some games than others. I liked him a lot in Little Hope and The Devil in Me, and not so much in the other Dark Pictures games. Sometimes he feels like he's just clocking in for work, sometimes he's genuinely invested. A character modelled on classic horror anthology narrators, he can come off as pretentious and smarmy, but I think that's all part of the fun. It's like watching one of my videos. Sometimes his hints are a bit too esoteric though, like he's just quoting authors for the sake of quoting an author, and it has nothing to do with what the game is actually trying to say. Still, I'm looking forward to meeting him again in Season 2.
I don't make mistakes.
Jamie carries the competency of the Devil in Me's Scooby gang. She's brash and sometimes standoffish, but she gets given the bulk of the difficult moral dilemmas and is shown to be a lot more rational than the rest of the cast. Her set pieces are fun, she makes up 2/3 of the game's major moral choices, and she genuinely has development in her relationships with other characters, notably Kate. Decisive, well-defined, and with consistent growth, Jamie isn't going to do anything to completely save this game from being one of the worst entries, but if this studio wanted to make more characters in this vein, I wouldn't be mad, I'd be quite happy in fact. The only casting of Frank Stone character to break the top 50%, Sam Green is far and away the best character from this game. With a personal rivalry with the killer and a storyline that means he only shows up for the interesting parts, Sam Green is something of a content herald. His appearance means the game is about to do something. On top of this, his obsessive nature and burning hatred of Frank Stone is a brilliant double-edged sword that both helps him protect innocence and drives him to awaken Christine's fascination, which in turn reawakens the killer. This is consistent characterization that can either paint Sam as good or bad depending on the context. He feels a lot more realised and human than any other character in this game, and that combined with the tension of the introduction that has Sam and Frank face off for the first time, makes Sam Green easily the best character in this game.
Why, Lord, why?
The primary antagonistic forces of Little Hope, Mary and Carver, are a package deal that speak to the themes of the game. Mary is the troubled child groomed by an opportunistic occultist, and Carver is that opportunist who is willing to stoke division within his community to advance himself. Little Hope is a game about healing and coming to terms with things you cannot change, of learning to forgive yourself and others. Mary is poised as an antagonistic force. Much of the game implies that she is at fault, but much like her 70s reincarnation Megan, she is the victim of implicit grooming that makes her an accomplice to the real evil, being Carver. It's a story about how sometimes people who wrong you are themselves victims, and learning to forgive them is important to heal. Anthony learning to understand Megan is a major part of some of the game's most impactful endings. Carver is a great character who I don't think gets anywhere near enough credit. Obviously he's based off the 1970s priest Carson, but also the Carver family whose relentless pursuit of power and profit ran the town of Little Hope into the ground. So he's an amalgamation of a lot of negative associations in Anthony's mind. Whilst yes, Carver and Carson do face consequences, in the modern day we see through clues and environmental storytelling that the Carver family still holds a great amount of power. Sometimes wrongdoers never face a comeuppance, and this is something Anthony has to deal with. I enjoy Little Hope's story for its focus on internalizing degrees of evil and coming to better understand your own traumas and forgive yourself. A big part of this is felt through the inclusion of Mary and Carver, who remain constants that drive the game forward through their influence on Anthony.
I have the one and only 24 karat gold Labubu.
The Quarry's mean girl, Emma, has one of the best set pieces of the earlier game, and her final confrontation with Jacob is, in my opinion, the single most cathartic and well realised potential final scene in The Quarry. Emma's arc is about maturation, of learning to put her foot down and end something, even though she doesn't particularly want to. Though, as with most things, Laura's inclusion sidelines her arc, Emma's story is a good small-scale story of learning to better assert yourself and define what you want. Emma and Jacob's breakup story is good because neither of them is really depicted as being completely in the wrong. Rather, in a far more realistic kind of writing, they're both inconsistent and contribute to the toxicity that only proves exactly why they shouldn't continue. On top of all of that, I do like mean girl type characters, and I wish that Emma was a bit more of a plot catalyst like her narrative ancestor Jess from Until Dawn. That said, I enjoy her inclusion and have come to enjoy it more upon subsequent playthroughs.
Boy, have you lost your mind, cause I'll help you find it.
Vince is an interesting non-playable character because every single ending in Little Hope is in some way tied to him, and knowledge of this makes a player pay a lot more attention to conversations with him. He's got a lot of tragedy to his character, and him haunting the town of Little Hope like a ghost adds so much to the eerie ambiance of the place, especially during a first playthrough. Vince's dialogue is on the whole very well written and foreshadows the twist without being too obvious most of the time. I think he was a very necessary addition who does a lot for the tone and pacing of Little Hope, and having a non-playable character be so inherently tied to the many and various endings really does do a lot to elevate him as a character. Rachel and Eric are fun characters, and I maintain that Eric specifically is very underrated. Driven by a consistent obsession with having complete control and visibility over everything following the loss of his leg in an accident caused by him not being perceptive enough, Eric's greatest strength in his job, his ability to study and observe things, also causes most of the issues in his life. It pushes away his wife and leads him headfirst into what may be his tomb. I love how all of Eric is built around this one trait. It's emblematic of what I like about the writing in House of Ashes. Everything feels very concise. In House of Ashes, nothing is overcomplicated. It's a very simple game, it's a very simple story. But every single character, monster design, even the environmental storytelling, it all just tells you one very specific thing, and each character is built around this one specific thing. It makes them all feel very well realised, they all have something to say, they all contribute to the central theme. There's this bit of concept art of Eric studying an alien corpse in a small tent surrounded by ruins of the past and brightly lit monitors, and I think it sums him up brilliantly. He's a guy who lives in the past and the present. He's also very astute. He likes to observe things. He likes to understand things before he has anything to do with them. Rachel, similarly, is defined by a simple but effective trope of being between two worlds. She exists both as the person she really is and as the image she presents. She's between two relationships with Eric and Nick, and can end the game in a chrysalis between human and alien. It feels very cathartic when Eric frees her from her ailment using the UV light, something he learned through his obsession with observation, the very same thing that initially pushed her away from him. Their relationship goes full circle. The interplay between these two characters, seeing them have to reconcile and understand what needs to change so they can move forward, is good. No matter how it plays out, it's engaging and tells us a lot about these characters. It's part of what makes House of Ashes so iconic in my opinion. While some of the family don't have a whole lot to do, particularly the werewolf kids Caleb and Kaylee, the Hackett's are a strong antagonistic force in The Quarry. Their inter-family dynamics add a lot of complexity to the werewolf mystery, and for only having short appearances, they all have very well-defined characteristics and roles. I like Chris as the major werewolf threat a lot more than Silas. He's a lot more of a presence throughout the game. Lynn Shay does a great job playing Constance as this overbearing and cruel but also highly maternal force within the family, and her death at the hands of Laura is one of the most shocking moments in the game. Jedediah is clearly a man long past his prime who is still putting his life on the line in his old age to try and save his kids and grandkids. and Bobby is an intimidating presence throughout the earliest chapters. Overall, I really enjoy the inclusion of the Hacketts and think they work far better for what the game is trying to do than Silas and Eliza.
Why does this keep happening to me?
I still don't personally like Ashley all that much, but I think I understand why people like her a lot better than I did when I covered Until Dawn, and I've come to appreciate her inclusion a lot more. Ashley can be read in a lot of ways, but I think most people come down too hard on either Ashley is a psychopath with a victim complex, or Ashley did quite literally nothing wrong and is a complete victim this entire game. In reality, she's just a scared teenage girl who makes bad decisions routinely and then tries to rationalize them after the fact. She's inconsistent, but that's consistent with how she's written, if that makes sense. Yes, her leaving Chris outside to die is horrifying and extremely frustrating on a playthrough, but it's very likely just her panicking, not some malicious act of manslaughter. Same with her pushing for Emily's death following Emily getting bitten. Yes, she does shift a lot of the blame for what happened to Hannah and Beth to the others and tries to absolve herself of guilt, but I think a lot of people would probably do the same. Ashley is difficult to like because she's so emotionally charged, and as players we tend to prefer characters that are always on the same page as us and these super cool under pressure stoics. But in reality, most of us aren't going to be acting like Gordon Freeman in every situation. Ashley adds a layer of depth and humanity to the cast of Until Dawn through her volatility, and whilst I would have liked to see more development of her relationship with Chris and know more about what she thinks of Josh and vice versa, I've developed more of an appreciation for Ashley as time goes on.
Why are you so obsessed with me?
Supermassive's original mean girl, Jess, is very easy to hate at the start and the source of one of the game's most memorable twists if she survives in the mines. Spending the entire night unaware of what's even happening, Jess's arc is one of seeing a character completely dismantled, their facade stripped away in the face of insurmountable horror. To see the popular girl who plays a very specific stereotypical role have her mask stripped away as she is left completely alone is simple but highly effective. Maybe not completely alone if Matt shows up, but whatever, who cares. I adore Jess's arc for being this beautifully tragic side story that just kind of runs parallel to Until Dawn. It expands the scope of the story and does wonders for characterizing Hannah further as the monster she is now. I also think Soul Survivor Jess, where she's just trying to rationalize what happened to her without any of the context, is a brilliant ending.
What's a father?
The patriarch of Little Hope, John is a solution-oriented man who is effectively a correction for Anthony's father. John spends the most time with Anthony, and through these interactions we see Anthony creating an illusory figure without any of his father's shortcomings. Where his father was a drunk, John is sober and recovering. Where his father was self-interested, John puts himself at risk for the sake of the family in his final scene. The moment where John congratulates Anthony for putting a rock through a window, the very thing Anthony did to try and save his father, is heartbreaking when you have the full context. John has added complexity though, because he can break his sobriety, he can abandon people and do stupid stuff like jump off bridges to get away from the most minor of jump scares. The reality of the situation seeps into him more than any other character. There's a pull from Anthony's memory that prevents John from being a perfect replacement. However, this only adds to John's character. Reforming has to be a concerted effort on the part of the player, and it makes the end of his story all the more narratively satisfying as he literally defeats his demons and saves his family. He's the only character with the locked trait system in this game, which is universally pretty bad, kind of works. Sure, this game is all one big hallucination, but it gives a real sense of closure and catharsis to Anthony that makes John's hallucinations feel a lot more real than the rest of the family.
I don't use my arms!
Dylan is the Quarry's funny man, and whilst the jokes don't always land, he got a chuckle or two out of me. I like that we get a lot of character insights into Dylan through how he interacts with others. He behaves very differently depending on who he's talking to, and that really helps to paint the picture of this social chameleon who is more acting than being himself. Also, Dylan is the only character whose job on the camp is ever even remotely relevant to the plot, using his AV skills several times to save people. Dylan spends the first half of the game with Ryan in this cute flirtation, but then when Ryan stops being a character, he jumps ship over to Caitlin in time for her to start doing interesting things. This leads to him being part of some of the most interesting set pieces. The junkyard is a standout moment for sure. Dylan losing his arm is also interesting, as very rarely in these games do characters suffer consequences that aren't just outright death. Him losing a limb as a result of a player choice is a consequence that is felt without completely removing the character from the game. Whilst I didn't think Dylan was always all that great, some of his jokes didn't land and some of his scenes felt a bit filler, I generally like this character.
I'm getting too much money!
Conrad is the MVP of Man and Medan. He's got the single best chapter in the game with Glamour Girl, and the massively branching nature of Man and Medan applies really well to him. It's crazy that he can just escape and leave the game before the characters even get to the Orang Medan, and the game factors in his return and what he might find when you get to the ending. I'm pretty sure this is the longest any of these games go from having you make a choice and then waiting to show you the outcome. It's like the entire game. Where other characters in Man of Medan feel hollow and interchangeable, Conrad feels like a character who has a lot of set moments and defined traits, but also a huge number of paths he can take through the story. This is what I feel Supermassive were going for with Man of Medan, and after playing as Conrad, I kind of see the vision. Where other characters just kind of chop and change segments based on who is alive, Conrad feels the most realised for Man of Medan. All of his potential routes seem like they were tailored specifically to him. A lot of the psychological horror in this game feels filler, like stock ghosts and ghouls, but his segments are genuinely personal to him and tell us more about him. This is another point in his favour. He doesn't just look at the camera and tell you what his deal is like he's Dora the Explorer or most Supermassive characters. To get the full picture on Conrad, you have to understand what his mind is trying to tell him through his visions and peel back the layers of his highly artificial persona. If every character was like this, capable of taking drastically different routes but all of them feeling tailor-made for them, then I would 100% hands down say Man of Medan is the best DPA game, but it isn't because it doesn't do that. Even still, I massively enjoyed my time with Conrad. He's just this lovable asshole.
British?
I love Charlie Lonnet so much, man. I don't know why. He kind of doesn't do anything. He spends most of the game either dead or coated in ash in a basement doing absolutely sod all. But I love him. I think mainly because he gave me a glimpse into what I wanted the devil in me to be. Narcissistic to an obscene degree and quick to anger, Charlie sets himself up perfectly for both dark comedy and horrific death traps. He's so reactive, and that allows Dumet to really mess with him. Some of the earlier scenes in the game where Dumet is just toying with Charlie, using the cigarette machine to wind him up, are my favourite scenes in the game. I wanted to see Dumet more committed to playing with the cast's emotions outside of just putting them in death traps. But as Charlie is the only character in the cast who ever really wears his heart on his sleeve like this, he's the only character I ever really feel Dumet's influence on. Whilst I don't think every character should have been as goofy as Charlie, I do think the dark comedy and sheer brutality of his segments should have carried over to the rest of the game. Charlie either dying or running out of content at the start of Arc 2 is felt extremely heavily as the game starts to take itself far too seriously following Charlie's first potential death. I really like Abby's arc in the Quarry of learning to be more confident and standing up for herself, but not in a way where she really has to change her core traits. She learns to navigate difficult social situations not by becoming meaner or colder, but through developing a better sense of self-worth and becoming more self-reliant. It's so interesting that her most likely deaths are tied to the two people she trusts the most, Nick and Emma, and making split-second decisions that might harm others but protect her are required to keep her alive. If Abby doesn't learn to trust herself, then she'll die. It's something she has to do to ensure her survival. Abby's arc feels so far removed from Laura's that it's one of the few character stories not completely derailed by Laura showing up, and it feels like a bittersweet coming-of-age story that you can enjoy whilst the rest of the cast are massacring old people and children. So that's fun. Mike is the most conventional survival horror protagonist in any of these games. He even gets the outfit. He gets a lot of fun gameplay segments where he shoots monsters and a cute wolf pair. His arc has a really interesting progression to it. He starts off seeming like a generic horny jock stereotype, and if this were basically any other Supermassive game, that's where his arc would end. However, as the game goes on, we see a tenderness and emotional rawness to Mike. I think he puts a lot of pressure on himself to be a leader, to project confidence, but this strength is also a major flaw because this guy is always making incredibly rash decisions that kind of screw everyone over. He's got a good heart, but his desire to be liked and his rash actions cause him to be kind of a loose cannon and just as much of a liability as he is an asset. Mike, like Jess, is a stock horror stereotype, but he's very much aware of that and is leaning into the performance. We get to see Mike as he presents himself to others, but also get so much time with him alone where we see how he really feels and how much he actually cares. On top of that, Mike has very distinct feeling to his segments. He doesn't play like any of the other characters. His segments take place in unique areas and have distinctly more action-oriented focus than the rest of the cast. This is a good thing in my opinion. It makes him stand out more not just through his personality, but through how the game feels. A player understands that Mike is a lot more aggressive and physical than other characters, purely through the game feel of his chapters. For all these reasons, Mike is for sure one of the better characters this studio has ever made, and easily one of the most fun to play as.
Neat. Therapy's fun.
Dr. Hill is far and away the best narrator type character. He has such an uneasy vibe that's only exacerbated by the decay that occurs in his office as the game goes on, mirroring Josh's mental state. The plot twist that he was speaking to Josh and is one of his hallucinations is one of the most impactful moments of the game. Through him we're given an angle into Josh's characterization that many other characters don't get. We get a voice for all his insecurities and fears. On top of that, Dr. Hill just has some great line delivery. It's always a treat to cut back to the office and hear from the guy. Really fun character.
That boy ain't right.
Starting off the top 10, we have one of the best side characters in any of these games, played brilliantly by horror icon Ted Raimi. Please go watch Candyman 1992. Travis is wonderfully unhinged, always feeling like a man on the edge. The stress of his family and his urgency to save others, often to his own detriment, is felt heavily from his first appearance in the prologue. His rapport with Laura is genuinely brilliant, and again makes me wish we had an entire game of just Laura and her wacky antics without all of the other stuff dragging it down. Travis is, in many ways, the real main character of the Quarry, but he's positioned against our hero so often that he's cast in the role of antagonist. There's this famous writing truism that every character should be the hero of their own story, and whilst this isn't something I completely agree with, I feel this statement is very true of Travis, and it's to his advantage. Pitting the player against someone who is so obviously trying to do the right thing but is being driven to drastic and cruel means by both his family and a time limit really adds a lot to the depth of Travis and opens him up for interpretation as either tragic victim or spineless coward who always takes the easiest route. So yeah, Travis is good, and I wish we could have got a whole game where the plot with Silas, the Hacketts and Laura wasn't completely sidelined for half the runtime and was given a lot more care.
Go positively bonkers, yeah? Go mad, bro.
Andrew is probably elevated in this list because he's kind of the only real character in Little Hope. He has an entire game dedicated to him where most of these characters only get segments in wider stories. But unlike most of these characters who just directly state their motivations in kind of clumsy ways, Andrew is someone we learn about through like 5 hours of hallucinations that specifically tell us about his relationships with his family, his relationship with religion, his obsession with witchcraft, and his mental state. I probably understand Andrew more so than any other character on this list because I've been given so much content about him, I've been in his head for 5 hours. He's still not my favourite, and a player can only really infer a lot of this on a second playthrough when they already know the twist. For a first playthrough, Andrew is actually quite passive. He only gets a few moments to really tell us in his own words how he feels, and most of his segments are saved for the end. That said, I do think Andrew is compelling enough to be the central focus of this game. The sheer misery of his mindscape is an interesting setting. Whilst I still think Tanya would have made for a better main character in a game about witches and witch trials, Andrew is still a pretty great main character, and the only real saving grace of going into this game already knowing the twist is being able to better understand his hallucinations and what they all mean in terms of mapping out his mind. Yeah, sure, he falls off halfway through the game, but my favourite scene in Until Dawn is still Chris going out into the snow when he knows there's a monster out there just to save Josh. Even though Josh has wronged him, put him in immense amounts of stress and emotional pain, Chris is such a bro that he's willing to risk his life for a friend. This scene alone does so much to tell us about Chris, who himself explains the butterfly effect through talking about his friendship with Josh. This act of bravery and camaraderie really makes a player feel how tragic Josh's story is. He was surrounded by people who really loved him like Chris and Sam, but he threw it all away by self-sabotaging instead of properly dealing with his pain. Chris also has some really fun segments with Psycho Josh, putting the player in faux moral dilemmas before the big reveal, which on a first playthrough are really intriguing. He's also just pretty funny, not as funny as Mike or Emily, but he brings a lot of good comedic moments to the table. Overall really solid character, falls off a lot after his potential death outside the cabin, but that's par for the course at this point. Jason has my favourite scene in any Dark Pictures game, which is where he talks about how he killed an innocent woman who was just carrying groceries. This scene hits so hard not just because of how harrowingly real and descriptive it is, but because of all the build-up. When we meet Jason, he's one of the most jingoistic people in the year 2003, which was an all-time high for that sentiment. He's actively committing war crimes on a largely civilian population, bringing white phosphorus into war zones and shooting at surrendering enemies. Jason is probably the most morally reprehensible character the series has ever let us play as, but it's this background that makes his arc all the more satisfying. As the group find themselves below ground and come face to face with horrors beyond anything they could have imagined, Jason is forced to reassess his understanding of the world, and through forced cooperation with Iraqi soldier Salim, someone he had previously likened to an animal, he comes to realise he actually has a lot in common with someone he was trying to kill only a few hours ago. In coming to this understanding, he looks back on previous wrongs he has committed and finally admits them. The whole game Nick has been trying to talk to him about the checkpoint, about the woman with the groceries, but he always dismisses it. Always talks about how it was necessary, but here, in the darkness of the Akkadian ruins, he admits he made a mistake, that he killed an innocent. Where a worse story probably would have had Jason become a total good guy right at the end, instead we see a much more realistic character growth. Jason remains extremely gung-ho and is still basically just a walking ball of testosterone that will shoot at anything, but he starts to channel this energy towards solving problems, protecting his friends, and doing the right thing. Rather than doing a complete 180, we see a subversion of existing character traits. Jason never stops being a gun-toting American the same way he started the game. Rather, he morphs into a more positive version of himself, focusing his energy on things that have a much more positive impact than what he was previously doing. He begins a journey of self-reflection, and we see him taking the first steps. We don't see him undergo years worth of change and unlearning everything he's thought to be true in a few hours. This is an incredibly satisfying arc to see play out and is a highlight of House of Ashes.
Oh my god, my Shayla.
Sam is so easy to like, it's actually insane how likable she is. She's just a classic horror movie final girl. She's close to the Washingtons and gives us insight into them, and her skill set lends itself well to the kind of set pieces the game wants to do. She's into rock climbing, and that plays out in all manner of fun gameplay moments. I've said before that Sam and Mike are the gameplay duo of Until Dawn, and I stand by that. Mike is the gunplay guy, and Sam basically gets all the fun chases and parkour bits. Sam doesn't do anything too crazy. I don't think any one scene with her really blew me away, apart from maybe the very last segment of the game, but I enjoyed every second I spent playing as her because she's just fun. She gets on with everyone. She's a girl's girl who acts as a really positive and focused force in an otherwise pretty messy cast. Sam is a death from 1,000 cuts of likability. It's not any single thing, but rather the complete picture of her that makes her such a universal fan favourite.
Top 10 guys who will keep you satisfied at summer camp.
Hehe, Jacob's so funny. Much of this placement is just Zach Tinker's performance. He's quite literally the best actor the studio has ever gotten in terms of really having fun with the mocap. Jacob has so many little quirks, not just with the way he speaks, but with his body movement. He spends most of the game running about in his underwear, stepping in bear traps and getting shot at. It's completely batshit. It's a joy to witness, because it feels like Supermassive at their silliest. Now, these games shouldn't be completely absurd all the time, but the better entries all lean a bit into the camp horror movie dark comedy. On top of this, players are incentivized to care and try and keep Jacob alive because he causes the entire thing to happen out of his selfishness, and his variable final scene with Emma feels so cathartic and acts as a much better ending scene than any other stuff with Silas and Laura. Ultimately, Jacob and Emma breaking things off and ending things amicably shows more character growth between them than quite literally any other character. Jacob becoming a werewolf and killing Emma, or her winning the fight, also plays with the tragic monster werewolf tropes found in all manner of classic werewolf media, far more so than any of the stuff with the Hackett's or even Nick. So whilst I don't have a lot of things to say about Jacob, he's a simple character done really well with a phenomenal performance. Please, Supermassive, get Zach Tinker back if you can, he's awesome here. I don't care anymore. I love Emily, and I don't particularly care if you don't. She's iconic. She shoves people out of the way in life or death situations and spends half the game in monster-filled woods looking for a designer bag to flex on everyone else. She drops the very first line of the game and sets the tone that she will be advancing the plot. Her messy antics quite literally cause everything to happen. She's the butterfly effect personified. She's smart but not humble. Her confidence borders on arrogance, and that makes her a perfect catalyst for this game. Not only is Emily the favourite character of both the creative director and design director of Until Dawn, but Supermassive Games have said in interviews about future games that they wrote other characters in the vein of Emily because of how effective she was in dividing players. Her being divisive is not only part of the character's appeal, but also a driving part of her characterization. It's like this weird meta-commentary, where both the player base and the characters in the game all have massively variable takes on Emily. That said, even her haters seem to love to hate her. Everyone has strong feelings about this character, no one's neutral. I just really like Emily as a presence in this game. She contributes almost all of the comedy, she elevates the game just by existing and adding this messy, unpredictable angle that no other character brings to the table. Her inclusion feels necessary and iconic. To all the Emily haters, I dare you to imagine the game without her and try and argue that it would be better. It wouldn't. She's part of the source that makes Until Dawn a banger. She's a brilliant character.
May Allah awaken the people.
Salim is a major part of what I like about House of Ashes. He does a lot of the heavy lifting for the themes of the game. From beginning to end, we see a man unlearn his hatred and change. But not only that, Salim acts as a catalyst for change in others. For a game about darkness in people's hearts, Salim is presented as the solution. He's driven and motivated entirely by love. He wants to survive because he loves his son and wants to see him grow up and succeed. He was pushed to war by a love of his country, but he's the first to put down his weapons and open dialogue with those who he is told are his enemies. This in turn changes the hearts of Nick and eventually even the extremely stony Jason, who forms a downright adorable bromance with Salim in the final act of the game. When Jason opens up to him about his darkest moments, Salim doesn't judge him but instead empathizes. Salim learns to trust others, but importantly, whilst he lets off the occasional semper fi, he doesn't lose himself in trying to appeal to others. He's not people-pleasing to a fault. I really like that Salim doesn't have to change who he is to build bridges with the American. I fear if this wasn't the case and Salim basically just morphed into another Jason, the game would be kind of bad. But as it stands, the message is, we can learn to empathise and open dialogue without immediately capitulating to the dominant side. An important part of being able to understand others is to have a good understanding of yourself, and you shouldn't have to change your fundamental traits to be a better person. On top of all that brilliant thematic interplay with the central point of the game, Salim is just downright funny. He has a lot of great line deliveries and little one-liners, as well as brilliant set pieces like when he crushes the alien with the car. He's clearly just a guy massively out of his depth from the moment we meet him, and he just flies by the seat of his pants trying to do his best. It's an absolute joy to play as Salim or even just see him on screen, and he was far and away the character that made House of Ashes such a gem in my eyes. The Handigo is quite literally the only unambiguously great villain Supermassive has ever written. I was kind of mad when Man of Medan came out and they were reusing Oh Death as the theme, because to me that will always be Hannah's song, the character who spoke with Death and returned a year later. As I stated over a year ago, Hannah is perfect for a game where the focus is player choice. Choice isn't just pressing buttons and seeing different cutscenes, it's allowing the player the freedom of choice to interact with the media in whichever way they want. The Handigo works as a mindless killing machine that fuels spectacle, but if you connect the dots of her potential behaviour, who she stalks and kills, how she kills them, how she potentially saves Josh, there's just enough humanity in there to make this visceral, almost Carrie-like revenge monster movie possible. Hannah is tragic to some, infuriating to others. She's so incredibly realised despite having no dialogue at all. Through the way she haunts the narrative and the monster she returns as, the player is completely free to view Hannah whichever way they want, sympathetic victim, selfish monster, or anything in between. The game is completely built around the Washington family, and Hannah is a huge part of that. She stalks the lodge, haunted by the ghosts of her family's failings and arrogance. She sets in motion the butterfly effect that leads to the entire game when she gets the butterfly tattoo to impress Mike, and her butterfly-like metamorphosis is the focus of the horror. So Hannah is amazing. There's so much symbology, there's so much relevance, there's so much fear factor, the design is amazing. But there is one character better, and it's another member of the Washington family.
I'm just joshing you.
So, previously, I made the case that the reason Until Dawn, the best game by Supermassive, works is due in large part to the character of Josh Washington, and this is probably the only take I've ever made that I've not even slightly budged on. So Josh goes from comic relief to main antagonist to tragic victim to potential monster, like his sister, and it's an absolute roller coaster to witness. With compelling dynamics with the entire cast and a psyche so complex that it elevates the entire game, all encapsulated perfectly through the ever-brilliant Rami Malek, Josh is difficult not to love. Of all the characters in this list, he has the most potential interpretations. The entire game can kind of be viewed as a therapy session with this guy. He kind of does Little Hope much better than Little Hope, just through the Dr. Hill segments. The dismal and confusing setting of the Washington Lodge, the fracturing of the friendship group following Hannah and Beth's disappearance, the night's slow unwinding into complete chaos and madness, it's all reflective of the unfurling tapestry of Josh's emotional state. As the game goes on, we watch him lose touch with reality, but even this isn't a cut and dry story of a mental breakdown. Ironically, despite constantly trying to write stories that can be interpreted as either supernatural or not with this air of vagueness, Supermassive has never done this as well as they did with Josh. Is his declining state a new low of pre-existing mental health problems, or is it the supernatural call of a spirit trying to possess his body, to claim the last in the Washington family, a name which calls to mind the colonial ambitions that inform his family's history of settling over cursed land without care for the damage they cause? Everything about Josh ties back to what I'm saying about the strengths of Until Dawn. Choices aren't just in what buttons you press, they're also in how you want to interpret the game. Josh has so many interpretations, almost all of his relationships can be viewed through various lenses. Does he hate Mike or does he revere him, constantly talking about his sexual prowess and manliness? Does he love Chris and genuinely think he's going to impress him with his sadistic pranks, or does he hate him for getting him drunk? Maybe he's even scared of losing him as he grows closer to Ashley. Is his connection to Sam simply a teenage crush, a way of getting closer with his missing sister's best friend to try and feel a connection to his missing family, or is he just very attached to her because she was there for him through the most difficult part of his life? How much does Josh genuinely think what he's doing is just a joke, and how much does he really genuinely want to hurt people? This can be talked about and argued back and forth all day, how much of this is poor mental health, his potential misdiagnosis and the potential call of the mountain spirits causing him to act out, and how much is a lucid and calculated revenge plot. None of this is an either or thing either. You can come up with your own highly unique take on Josh. Everyone views this character differently. This is even more so the case with the all-new Josh Survivor ending being a highlight of the 2024 remake, opening the game up to further analysis and even a potential sequel, which could be really fun. Oscillating with the game's tone, his unravelling is what sets the pace of things. This classic game is in many ways really all about Josh, and his arc is 100% the secret sauce that makes Until Dawn so much better than anything the studio have done since. Okay, so that is every single character until Season 2 of the DPA, so I'll see you then. Thanks again to Konami for sponsoring this video and the channel members for choosing this topic. I'll see you next time. Bye.